Hey, good afternoon to you. It is now 5:06 News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up on the program, the Attorney General of the state of Tennessee, Jonathan Skrmetti, is here to discuss this morning's oral arguments in the United States Supreme Court in the case of U.S. versus Skrmetti, which will determine whether or not Tennessee is indeed allowed to ban the mutilation of children. I can't even believe it took a Supreme Court case to talk about that. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Okay, quite a bit going on. You've got, first today, the Daniel Penny jury deliberations are continuing to the point that the jury was sent home for the day. So they started yesterday around noon. They deliberated for hours. They recessed for the evening, and then they came back today. They deliberated all day long. Jury questions have been coming back to the judge. But it sounds to me right now like we're heading for a hung jury in this case, which is probably the best that Daniel Penny can hope for. I don't know if you saw any of the courtroom sketches of the jury, but there was a woman wearing a COVID mask in the jury pool right at the end of the jury box. And he said, "Oh crap, that's not going to work out nicely for Daniel Penny. I know what she's into, and it's not justice. It's not. The woman's scared. She shouldn't have been selected. Was she wearing the mask during jury selection? That should have been your first tell. It's New York though. So Daniel Penny, the Marine, the guy, he's the guy on the train. He's the guy on the train who actually stands up to the assailant who's threatening to kill the people on the train, said he's ready to go to jail for it. He stands up, takes him down. And when the cops finally get there, they find a pulse on the guy. He's still alive. That came out during the trial. And now the jury is deliberating whether or not Daniel Penny murdered him. What a crazy world we live in. So there's that story today. Additionally, a police manhunt is underway in New York City today after a gunman opened fire this morning, in the dark hours this morning, assassinating, in a very obvious assassination, the CEO of United Healthcare, an executive called Brian Thompson. Here's how the New York Times is reporting the latest. A furious manhunt was underway in Manhattan after the head of one of the nation's largest health insurers was gunned down on Wednesday morning in what the police called a, quote, brazen targeted attack. A gunman lay in wait for the executive outside of a hotel in Midtown, the heart of the city's business and tourist districts, and he opened fire before fleeing into Central Park, according to investigators. Surveillance video that was obtained by the New York Times, it's now everywhere, you can see it all over the internet, shows the gunman walking up behind the executive, Brian Thompson, 50 years old, as he approaches one of the entrances to the New York Hilton Midtown around 6:45 a.m. The New York Hilton Midtown. Well, that's a stone's throw from Fox News, actually, right there in Midtown Manhattan. That is, I'm not super familiar with all the streets of New York, but I can tell you that is where Donald Trump held his victory party in 2016, that very building. Brian Thompson was approaching one of the entrances to the Midtown Hilton around 6:45 this morning. The gunman fires on Mr. Thompson, who stumbles and manages to turn towards his assailant. The video also shows what investigators said was the pistol jamming during the shooting and the assailant quickly clearing the jam and resuming fire. Yeah, it's a little murky what's going on there. The guy has a gun. The barrel length looks extended to the point that people are pointing out that it looks like he's got some sort of suppressor on it. And he fires a shot, and he looks like he tries to re-rack it, that he pulls the slide back for some reason, the kind of the way that you might want to clear a jam on a gun. I've seen other people speculating that it could be a different kind of gun where it keeps the subsonic ammunition in it, and you pour the casing out, and you keep it in your hand so you can make off without the casing getting on the ground. But the point is, the guy was lying in wait. I saw some reports it was 20 minutes lying in wait for him. He waited for the guy to pass him before he took a shooter's position. He squared up on him, held the gun straight up, and began firing at least the first shot. And then in between each shot, it looked like he was trying to pull back the slide. perhaps to clear a jam. So it's not entirely clear what was going on there, but man, I hope we get some answers soon. Mr. Thompson collapsed on the sidewalk before the gunman fled. He apparently jumped on one of the city bikes, one of the city rental bikes, to make his getaway. The city police commissioner, Jessica Tisch, said the attacker had waited for Mr. Thompson, ignoring other passersby, and then shot him in the back and the leg. Three shell casings were recovered, from the scene on 54th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues. A cell phone recovered from the area where the assailant fled was being analyzed to see if it was linked to the shooting. Investigators were still searching for the gunman, who they said was last spotted in the sprawling park in central Manhattan. A surveillance image released by the police showed that the moment a person in a black hooded garment and wearing a backpack opened fire on Mr. Thompson, and another showed a person riding what investigators said was an electric city bike. Apparently, the assailant was inside of a nearby Starbucks just before the shooting. Surveillance images from the coffee shop released by the police in the afternoon appeared to show a white man in a dark hooded coat with a dark mask covering his mouth and nose. You know, I couldn't help but notice the silhouette of this guy looked a lot like the I'm not, by the way, before I even say this, I'm not saying it's the same person. I'm just saying it's the same uniform as the guy who left the quote, pipe bombs outside of the DNC and the RNC. Like the hoodie pulled up, the mask over the face. Nobody has any idea who it is. Maybe we'll never know. The guy got away. In a city like New York, you think about how many cops they have there, how many cameras they must have there. New York City, sort of one of the most up-armored cities in the country, you would assume. He's gone. Right now there's a manhunt going on. They're trying to figure out where he is. And so it's yet another really just crazy reminder of what's happening in some of America's biggest cities. That is our biggest city, New York. And they are right now prosecuting Daniel Penny for being a good Samaritan. He is awaiting what must be a very arduous deliberation between these jurors. And then you've got nearby assassinations, cold-blooded assassins in the streets of New York, gunning down the CEO of one of the biggest health insurance companies on the planet, just in the middle of the street. What is happening? This is what, don't you, it's just a part of the general specter of chaos that we're all still dealing with, and we'd like to see go away, right? You'd like some peace. You'd like to be able to walk through Midtown Manhattan. You'd like to be able to walk to your conference at the Midtown Hilton without being shot by a guy with a suppressor. That's the least I'm asking here. John's calling in from Fairfax on line 4. John, good afternoon, sir. You're on the Vince Colonnade Show.
Hey, Vince, love your show as always. I've called it several times before. Love it.
Thank you.
Hey, look, bottom line up front, I'm not trying to blame the victim, as you know, on any level. I don't know any CEOs. I may have met one or two over my course of military and civilian service, over the years. But I've just never known folks with that level of that, especially running one of the largest healthcare organizations in the nation.
Yeah.
Right? And at that CEO level, there wasn't any personal security for that person, especially when you go to an already well-documented, high-crime-rated city. I don't care if you're walking 2 feet, much less 2 blocks. And I'm just sort of kind of wanted to get your opinion on it, if there is even one. I hate to see this tragedy, and I'm not trying to blame the victim.
Yeah.
But man, oh man, if you're that status, that's the first thing, especially with the previous threats.
Yeah, it's hard to,
things I go to.
There's you be in Washington, D.C., we have a lot of, the rich and the famous, the powerful, who traverse the city. And not everybody travels with security and nevertheless armed security for that matter. And there's all sorts of people who have lots of money. I mean, this guy, I just looked it up as you were talking. His annual pay package, according to U.S. News today, because everyone's doing these bios on who he was $10.2 million. That's a lot of money. And so you'd imagine that maybe he'd have something like that. But then, Elon Musk, by the way, if I'm Elon Musk, man, I'm paying for the best security ever, and I'm sure he is. The guy's worth, this is just a random search, but he's worth $337 billion. Unbelievable. Yeah, you'd have SEAL Team 6 veterans all surrounding you all the time to keep you safe. But it's just crazy. I think part of this, too, if I'm being honest, John, is there's some of us who still kind of are convinced that America is the kind of place where you can successfully walk to your business meeting without being shot to death. Some of us, maybe perhaps foolishly, are hoping that it's not a third world country where these types of assassinations take place with frequency.
Especially where United Healthcare is actually centralized, located, or headquartered. You may get that sort of bubble. You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe so. But he's dead today, and a manhunt's underway. I hope they can find this guy. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people speculating that it looked super professional. It was a very professional hit. I have nothing to compare it to. Other than Hollywood movies, he didn't look like John Wick. He just looked like a guy who opened fire and clearly had contemplated it in advance. But I do hope they get him into custody and we can figure out what the heck just happened so as we can prevent it in the future. Hey, John, thank you.
Me too. Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that call.
Take care.
You do well. You be well too. Hey, I mentioned, and I've got to get to it, this Politico piece just out this afternoon that the Biden White House is now discussing preemptive pardons for, quote, those in Trump's crosshairs. That's what the headline says. In other words, just people who President Trump would like to subject scrutiny to, potentially, maybe we should issue blanket pardons for all of them. Remember all of the chit-chat about, Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, that justice is blind, and that nobody's above the law. Do you remember all of that? Boy, that was a really fun time, wasn't it? And now, on the way out, Joe Biden is handing out literal get-out-of-jail-free cards to everyone he could Why doesn't he just write a blanket pardon for anybody who's registered as a Democrat? I mean, that's how close they're getting right now. All registered Democrats have 11 years of pardons for any federal crimes you may have committed over the course of the past 11 years. It's the Hunter Biden standard, now applied to all Kamala voters. President Joe Biden's senior aides are conducting a vigorous internal debate over whether to issue preemptive pardons to a range of current and former public officials who could be targeted with President-elect Donald Trump's return to the White House, according to senior Democrats familiar with the discussions. Targeted should mean, let's be honest about what this is. People who would be scrutinized and, if they had violated the law, would be prosecuted as a result of that. They're being targeted. Biden's aides are deeply concerned about a range of current and former officials who could face, this is duplicative. Why are you saying this? Redundant. You keep saying it. Tell me who. Tell me who. The deliberations touch on pardoning those currently in office, elected and appointed, as well as former officials who've angered Trump and his loyalists. Those who could face exposure include such members of Congress, January 6th committee, as Senator-elect Adam Schiff, old pencil neck, and former GOP Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming. Why? What law did Liz Cheney break? Tell us, please. Why issue pardons for Adam Schiff and Liz Cheney? What did they do wrong? Trump has previously said Cheney, quote, should go to jail along with the rest of the unselect committee. Also mentioned by Biden's aides for a pardon is Anthony Fauci, the former head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, who became a lightning rod for criticism from the right during the COVID-19 pandemic. What they should have said is people with their heads on right, not just the right. Anthony Fauci was smuggling funding to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He was orchestrating the cover-up of that very detail. He was working fervently to convince you that some poor villagers who were at a wet market in Wuhan, China, were responsible for getting this virus out. They invented it right there. They made a custom virus right there in the middle of the wet market, and then they released it into the world. Rather than U.S. funding was pouring into the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is where they collect coronaviruses from bats and then work on them to make them more deadly to humans. Kind of seems like the place that did it, if we're being honest. Anthony Fauci right at the center of it, and the cover-up, and sticking up for the World Health Organization. You remember the early days? As the WHO was like, hey, don't worry about China. China's doing great. They're doing a great job. And then Anthony Fauci would come along and say, hey, the World Health Organization is doing a great job. China's doing a great job. And just the consistent lying that was served. Lying about natural immunity thresholds, lying about the state of the vaccine and whether or not it was effective. So, yeah, does he deserve scrutiny? Unquestionably. He deserves a lot more scrutiny. A Biden pardon could be coming. The West Wing deliberations have been organized by White House counsel Ed Siskel, but include a range of other aides, including Chief of Staff Jeff Zients. The president himself, who was intensely focused on his son's pardon, has not been brought into the broader pardon discussions yet. So the pardon power, which is the president's power, it's the string pullers around him who are now talking about blanket pardons for all of their friends. They're orchestrating the final act of a cover-up. That's what this story is. The Biden administration is plotting history's biggest cover-up before our very eyes, before they hit the exits. Just thought you should know. Coming up, Jonathan Skrmetti, the Attorney General of Tennessee. Big Supreme Court case today, U.S. versus Skrmetti. We talked to Skrmetti on behalf of U.S. Good afternoon to you. 5:35 here at News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us today, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. A Tennessee law that was enacted back in 2023, last year, blocks so-called gender transition surgery for minors, as well as puberty blockers and hormone therapy. Those are drugs that you would inject into the kids to convince them they were born in the wrong body. Tennessee law says you can't do that. Well, this has been taken all the way up to the United States Supreme Court today. Oral arguments in the court in that case, now known as U.S. versus Skrmetti. Joining us now to discuss that is the Attorney General of Tennessee, Jonathan Skrmetti. Mr. Attorney General, good to have you on the program, sir.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the basics of what this law actually does.
So this is a law that says if you are a doctor, you cannot provide puberty blockers or hormone treatments or surgery to minors for the purpose of gender transition.
Got it. All right. So this can't be done to children. You can't abuse these kids. All right. So that's the law. And you've had some left-wing organizations, to include the ACLU, who have taken this fight all the way up now to the United States Supreme Court. And as I understand their argument, to the extent that they have one, they were trying to make a claim that this is a 14th Amendment violation because it discriminates against people on the basis of sex. But, Mr. Attorney General, is there any language in the law that would even target someone on the basis of sex? It just says you can't do this to kids.
So they point to the fact that it prohibits cross-sex hormones. So they say because the law says that you can't give testosterone to girls, you can't give estrogen to boys, that it's drawing a sex discrimination line there. Of course, the issue is boys and girls are different. This is a law that targets the harm. It targets giving gender transition drugs to kids. Mm-hmm. And it's just an incidental fact that because boys and girls are different, that means you're looking at different drugs in different contexts. So, their position is that under a strict and formal reading, this is sex discrimination. We think that's just not an appropriate way to read the Constitution. It would effectively make it very difficult to protect kids when there are biological differences between boys and girls.
Well, especially because the law, it protects both boys and girls equally, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay, so today the ACLU's attorney, a woman representing herself as a man known as Chase Strangio, she was asked by Justice Alito whether or not being transgender is a, quote, immutable characteristic. And, boy, I got to tell you, Mr. Attorney General, that was not a good moment for the ACLU because she seemed kind of dumbfounded as to how to answer that because an immutable characteristic means it can't be changed.
Right. Transgender is such a broad term, right? I mean, you have your what everybody thinks of as transgender, man to woman or woman to man, but there are all these other genders out there now. And then there's gender fluid, which means that sometimes you are one gender and sometimes another. And the reason it's an important question is because a characteristic has to be immutable for the court to recognize a new category of protected class. And one of the issues is whether the Constitution recognizes transgender status as a protected class. So the fact that it is not an immutable characteristic really hurts the argument that the Constitution provides special protection to transgender status.
In fact, by describing something as fluid, what you're also saying is that it's mutable.
Correct.
That it can be changed. Okay, all right, just making sure I understand. How do you think you fared today in the arguments before the Supreme Court?
I think we put on a great case for Tennessee. I think we made forceful arguments. There were a lot of tough questions. There were tough questions on both sides. I don't ever want to prognosticate. You've got 9 justices. They have a lot of time to think about this before the opinion comes out. But I'm really proud of the case that we put on. And, Tennessee as a state, the legislature, the governor, everybody in the state is working hard to protect kids. And I think we held up our end of that today.
I was thinking today as I was listening to some of this that, the Dobbs decision, which involved basically handing back control over abortion legislation to the states, if the Supreme Court did that, where they said, the decisions about whether or not to end the life of a child should be left to the states, shouldn't decisions about whether or not to do these types of surgical or medical interventions on a child also be left to the states?
Well, at the end of the day, we live in a representative democracy where the people govern themselves through their elected representatives. The courts have a role to play in making sure that the constitutional guardrails are maintained. But we have government of the people, and that doesn't work if judges step in and say, well, the people, we don't like the policies you've adopted. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important for the ongoing legitimacy of our Federalist Republic that the courts ensure that the people's voice is heard, except where the Constitution clearly says that there's a limit.
Yeah, and another big piece here is, they talk about, protecting the rights of immutable classes of people. This case, despite the way the left talks about it, it very much involves, or at least it glances off of protecting the rights of women. Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti. So many of the people who were outside of the courthouse today were women or people who were fighting for women to protect them from an ideology that is basically allowing men to invade their spaces and take their honors.
Yeah, so this case is strictly focused on medicine, but if the court adopts a level of scrutiny here for future analysis, that could very much impact the bathroom cases, the sports cases, and I think the justices very much realized that. They asked a lot of questions that seem to indicate, they see this as potentially a significant precedent-setting decision that they're making. So it does impact women. And, of course, with kids, every systemic analysis of the research shows minimal to no benefit to kids from these gender transition procedures. The risks are enormous, permanent loss of fertility, among many other adverse outcomes. So there's a lot at stake here, both in the case immediately before the court and in where the law develops.
Sure. And finally, the court, in terms of how it decides to take up cases like this, I do feel that the public is on your side, Attorney General Skrmetti, on this, that nobody's for harming kids in this way. All the public surveys definitely show this. Do you think the Supreme Court was aware of that as they took up this case and they heard these arguments today?
It's always hard to say. I think they don't tend to. I don't have any inside knowledge of this. I suspect they don't pay that much attention to where the public is at, and they really are looking at the legal issues and what's bubbling up through the courts. And there are a lot of these cases bubbling up through the courts. And the other interesting thing is it was the ACLU and the United States, the Biden administration, that asked the court to hear this case. So they were pushing for the court to weigh in here.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me that they did, because I realized the ACLU's attorney, Chase Strangio, I don't think she's ever been subjected to real educated scrutiny before, because she collapsed under very basic questioning today. And I thought it's kind of really exposed the ideology for what it is.
I mean, there were hard questions for everybody, but at the end of the day, the gender identity movement has happened very quickly. I mean,
Yes.
there's always been people with gender dysphoria, but we've seen these radical changes attempted in the last few years, and I think you're seeing a lot of backlash to that.
Yeah.
And when people try to use longstanding laws to push this new agenda, a lot of people just really don't think our country should work that way.
No. Well, thank you, Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti of the great state of Tennessee. Thanks for coming to Washington, D.C. today to fight for decency. Really appreciate your time on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Have a great night.
Good to chat with you. There he is, the Attorney General of Tennessee from the case that has his name, Supreme Court, U.S. versus Skrmetti is the case. Really remarkable. It was remarkable to listen to some of these exchanges today, which are just bananas. Here's Justice Sam Alito pointing to one of the largest available studies on the planet on what's happening to these kids, so-called transgender kids, and finding that there's no evidence whatsoever that subjecting them to life-altering surgeries or sterilization or medication is actually going to decrease their risk of suicide.
But on page 195 of the CAS report, it says, there is no evidence that gender affirmative treatments reduce suicide.
What I think that is referring to is there is no evidence in the studies that this treatment reduces completed suicide. And the reason for that is completed suicide, thankfully and admittedly, is rare, and we're talking about a very small population of individuals with studies that don't necessarily have completed suicides within them. However, there are multiple studies, long-term longitudinal studies that do show that there is a reduction in suicidality, which I think is a positive outcome to this treatment.
A word game being played there as she admits in open court that no, there is not an increased risk of suicide for those who don't have their body altered by this evil industry. Also, Justice Alito, who is wonderful, by the way. We do have some really great Supreme Court justices. Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas, Justices Thomas and Alito just really are amazing. And here's Justice Alito asking that question about immutability. When something's immutable, that means it cannot be changed. It's immovable. And yet, take a listen to this exchange.
Does the category of, does transgender status apply to individuals who are gender fluid?
I think that the distinguishing characteristic is to have a birth sex that does not align with, or a gender that does not align with one's birth sex. So it may include people who have different understandings of their gender identity, but I think it is still the distinguishing characteristic of a birth sex and a gender identity that are incongruent.
Are there individuals who are born male, assigned male at birth, who at one point identify as female, but then later come to identify as male, and likewise for individuals who are assigned female at birth, at some point identify as female, identify as male, but later come to identify as female? Are there not such people?
There are such people. I agree with that, Justice.
So it's not an immutable characteristic, is it?
Well, I think people's understanding of it shifts, but the evidence shows that there is at least a strong underlying basis. And I think the normative reason for that particular consideration is whether or not this is something that someone should or could change, and whether they should have to change it in order to receive constitutional protections. And I think transgender status squarely fits within that.
I love that. The idea that it shifts over time. So that's true. It does shift, but it's immutable. Well, no, it's not. This is so once again, so everything about this entire ideology involves deception of language and worse. It's like, that's a man. No, that's a woman. Well, that's a woman. No, that's a man. That's immutable. No, that's literally mutable. You just changed. What is, Sam Alito's like, what is gender fluid? What does that mean? Well, you have a shifting understanding of what you are. Then you're literally declaring that there's an entire gender that is not immutable. Isn't it amazing? And so Chase Strangio, she spends all of her time in MSNBC. What is that name, by the way? I don't think that's a birth name. She spends all of her time in MSNBC green rooms talking to all these people who violently agree with her. Like, yeah, no, totally. Transgender, immutable. Yeah, no, that's a dude. No, yeah, that's a woman. She gets very basic questions from a great American, Justice Sam Alito, brilliant guy. He just asks her, hey, so transgender, is that immutable? Just collapse. The whole house of cards just collapses. Because he's still using logic, reasoning, conventional understanding of American language, Webster's dictionary. Well, forget Webster's. They're politically biased now. There's always shenanigans going on there. He has an old copy of Webster's. That's the English that he uses. And meanwhile, she doesn't. She has chaos language. She speaks in a way that's designed to subvert your understanding of reality. And the case today involved harming children, which means that there are very real consequences to that. All right, let's go to the phones. I've got Phil calling in from Alabama right now on line one. Hello, Phil. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Hey, Vince. I'm a recent transplant from Loudoun County to beautiful, sunny Alabama. I just heard that Mike Chapman, sheriff of Loudoun County, wonderful sheriff of Loudoun County, was under consideration to be Trump's DEA head, and I think it would just be an absolutely fabulous pick.
You know, that's I think you're breaking that news to me. That Mike Chapman. You said you heard it on our air. Oh, is it? Have we been reporting that
on one of the breaks? It might possibly have been that Mike was asked to comment on it, and he said he would be willing, open to the idea.
Well, that's cool. I like that.
Perhaps I'm jumping the gun a little.
He no, that's awesome. I mean, as much as I know about it is what you've told me about it, other than to say that he apparently has worked extensively he was with the DA, I think, for decades.
Yeah.
So he's well positioned, and I know Sheriff Chapman. I know his commitment to getting rid of the drug problem in Loudoun County, and he's got the right spirit and the actual expertise and time in service to be the right guy. They just yesterday the big news was that President Trump withdrew that Hillsborough County, Florida sheriff. Who he was happy with that guy's record when it came to going after fentanyl, but perhaps was unaware that he had arrested pastors during COVID. The guy yesterday released his own statement saying he was withdrawing his name from consideration. President Trump followed up today by saying, "No, I withdrew him from consideration after what he did to the pastors." So that's the update. Hey, Phil, thank you. There's Phil in Alabama with an endorsement for Loudoun County Sheriff Mike Chapman to become the next head of the DEA. That could be really good. Another guest of the Vince Coglianese Show disappearing into the Trump administration. Going on for the next great thing, helping America. Hey, stay with us. The great one, Mark Levin himself, is up next here on WMAL. And join us tomorrow. The Fisher House Radiothon begins. I'm counting on you. I need your help. I got to beat all these other shows into submission.